The silence filled the house, clinging to every corner as if it were a memory that refused to fade. It pressed down on everything, from the furniture to the shelves, creating a stillness that was almost tangible. There were moments when she could almost convince herself that she could hear his footsteps echoing down the hallway, or his voice humming the familiar songs they had once shared. Even the soft creak of his chair at the dinner table lingered in her mind. Noah had been gone for 2 years, and though the world outside had continued to move forward, inside her home, time seemed to have come to a standstill. Her name was Olivia, a woman who had always prided herself on her strength. But after Noah's passing, that strength felt as fragile as a shell, breaking under the weight of solitude. She often told herself that she would be fine, that life would eventually get easier, but it never did. The emptiness left by his absence became a persistent pain, one that no distraction could ease. Even though she had been seeing a therapist, the grief remained, a quiet but constant companion that followed her wherever she went. She thought often about the old house they had built together, a place that still held every memory of him. It was on one particular afternoon, as she stood in the living room looking out the window, that the idea came to her. A dog, she whispered to herself. Maybe that was what she needed. She had never been fond of animals, unlike Noah, but the loneliness had become unbearable. Perhaps a companion could help fill the void. She contacted the local shelter, and over the next few days, she visited again and again, unsure which dog would be the right fit. Each one seemed to look at her with eyes that spoke without words. But it wasn't until she met Milo that something inside her shifted. He wasn't the most attractive dog, with his unkempt fur and mismatched eyes that seemed far more intelligent than his appearance suggested. When Olivia first approached him, he didn't react immediately. He didn't jump or wag his tail. Instead, he simply looked at her, tilting his head slightly, almost as if assessing her. Then, unexpectedly, he nudged his nose against the bars of his cage, silently asking for attention. Without thinking, Olivia reached out to him, and before she knew it, he was following her home. His paws scratched the floor as he wandered around, sniffing everything and marking his new territory with the excitement of a fresh start. Olivia followed him, her heart filled with an odd mix of hope and hesitation. She was grateful for his presence, for the way he seemed to breathe life back into the house. That first night, she allowed him to sleep beside her. She had expected it to feel strange, sharing her bed with a dog she barely knew. But it was surprisingly comforting. He curled up next to her, his head resting against her side, and for the first time in months, Olivia felt something resembling peace. The rhythmic sound of his breathing lulled her to sleep, and for a brief moment, she forgot about the emptiness in her heart, the absence of Noah, and the years of grief that had weighed her down. Over the next few weeks, Milo became more than just a dog. He became her companion, her confidant, the one who stayed by her side when she couldn't bear to be alone. His presence was a constant comfort, a soft tail wag, or a gentle nudge offering solace. She found herself talking to him as though he could understand every word, as if he could somehow fill the emptiness that Noah had left behind. There were moments when she would sit on the couch, reading a book or watching TV, and Milo would lay at her feet, his gaze never leaving her. In those moments, Olivia couldn't help but think that perhaps Noah was watching over them, and that he had sent Milo into her life to help her heal. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Olivia walked to the kitchen, with Milo following closely behind. She poured herself a glass of wine and turned back toward the living room, only to be surprised to find Milo sitting at her feet, his large brown eyes fixed on her. "I'm not sure what I would do without you, Milo," she murmured absent-mindedly, scratching her ears, as Milo's tail gently tapped the floor. Men paused, seemingly understanding her unspoken meaning. Olivia smiled at him, her heart warming, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't in years. Little did she realize this quiet, unassuming dog was about to change everything for her. As the days passed, Olivia became more and more attached to Milo. She began to see him not merely as a dog, but as a companion, even a confidant. At night, she let him sleep next to her, finding comfort in the warmth of his presence, which helped soothe her loneliness. During the stillness of the night, Olivia often found herself awake, her thoughts drifting first to Noak, then to Milo, and at times, she would whisper his name, as if calling to Noak. Sometimes, she believed she could feel a response, an almost imperceptible warmth brushing against her. She even wondered if Milo wasn't just a dog, but perhaps Noak, reborn in a different form. Though she quickly dismissed this fleeting thought, the more time she spent with him, the harder it was to ignore the sensation that somehow, in some way, he was filling the emptiness Noak had left behind. One evening, as Olivia sat on the couch, Milo curled up next to her with her hand gently resting on his head. She couldn't help but smile. This might have been what she had longed for all along. The solace of companionship, the intricate joy of having someone beside her once again. Still, a faint voice in her mind warned her that things weren't as simple as they seemed. But for the moment, Olivia pushed aside those thoughts and basked in the warmth of the present, with Milo by her side. Days turned into weeks, and Olivia's life seemed to revolve around a predictable routine. Wake up, walk Milo, feed him, let him out into the yard, and then spend the rest of the day together. The mornings were peaceful, the silence heavy and suffocating, but Olivia had grown accustomed to it. The silence in the house no longer disturbed her, not as much as it once did. Milo's steady and calm presence had brought a sense of stability to the emotional chaos she had experienced. Yet there was something Olivia hadn't fully realized until this moment. Despite Milo becoming her close companion, she had begun to rely on him in ways she hadn't expected. She had once linked her emotional well-being to Noak, but now it was primarily connected to Milo. She noticed the small details, how his constant gaze followed her every movement, showing a loyalty that made her the center of his world. She wasn't used to such attention, yet it felt oddly reassuring. At night, when she climbed into bed, she could feel Milo nestling next to her, his warm form pressing against her. What had begun as his need for security and her desire for companionship had evolved into a silent ritual. She had always been cautious about forming attachments, especially to temporary things, but her bond with Milo had developed so naturally and gradually that she hadn't realized its depth until it had solidified. One evening, while Olivia was engrossed in a book, Milo jumped up beside her, as he often did, and rested his head in her lap. She absent-mindedly stroked his fur, momentarily lost in her thoughts. The outside world seemed distant and unimportant. She thought of Noak and the permanence of never hearing his voice again. The world had moved on during her absence, leaving her in a quiet home filled with memories. But here was Milo, as if his warmth could bridge the gap and fill the emptiness. She briefly wondered if he understood the depth of her sorrow and sensed the lingering presence of Noak that still lingered in the corners of the house. It was a fleeting thought, one she quickly dismissed, telling herself that Milo was just a dog. At first, the changes in their relationship were subtle, hardly noticeable. It began with small shifts, Milo becoming more persistent in his desire to stay close to her, his movements and nudges at night becoming more deliberate. Olivia didn't think much of it, attributing it to the natural affection dogs have, and Milo had always been a bit clingy. However, one night, after returning home late from a meeting, she noticed something different. She entered the living room to find Milo sitting by the door, waiting for her. Instead of greeting her with his usual tail wag, he simply stared at her, his dark eyes following her every movement. "Hey, Milo," she said, trying to break the tension. A sudden sensation crept up her spine. He didn't reply, but his gaze remained fixed on her. There was something unusual in the way he looked at her, something that made her stop for a moment, her heart racing just slightly. She attributed it to her own exhaustion, perhaps even imagining things, but the feeling stayed with her, lingering just beyond her conscious thoughts. The following days were filled with more of the same. Milo was almost always by her side, more than usual. She couldn't understand why he had become so determined to stay close to her. When she went to the kitchen to prepare a cup of tea, he would sit by the door, his eyes locked on her. When she went to the bathroom, she would open the door to find him sitting there, waiting. It wasn't that he was being overly demanding, but the intensity of his attention began to unsettle her. He seemed to watch her in a way that was beyond just seeking affection from a dog. It felt as though he was anticipating something. One night, she woke in the middle of the night to find Milo lying at the edge of the bed, his face just inches from hers. His breath was soft against her skin, but his eyes were wide open, fixed on her. She blinked, confused. In a moment, he pressed his nose against her cheek, drawing closer. "Milo, what?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep, but the dog stayed still and unresponsive. He simply lay there, his body pressed against hers in a protective manner, with no discomfort or hesitation. He was just present, warm and solid, and CLA felt herself relaxing into his presence. Yet something remained in the back of her mind. She wasn't used to such attention from anyone, especially not from a dog. Over the following nights, the pattern continued. Milo would climb into bed with her, curling up beside her, his body pressed against hers in a way that felt strangely intimate, almost as if he were staking a claim over her space. Occasionally, in the middle of the night, Olivia would awaken to find him nudging her, as if trying to get closer. It wasn't an overtly sexual gesture, but it was unlike the usual way a dog would cuddle. At first, Olivia dismissed it as just the dog being affectionate, but the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her logical mind suggested that her loneliness and desire for connection were causing her to misinterpret Milo's actions. But deep down, she sensed a shift in their relationship. She struggled to articulate the unexplainable sensation and tried to ignore the growing tension. She couldn't afford to dwell on it, especially given her dependence on Milo's companionship. She feared that confronting the reality that her feelings for him might go beyond mere affection could complicate things, yet the increasing closeness between them was undeniable. Milo started to attune to her emotions in ways that felt almost sentient. When she was sad, he would stay close, resting his head on her lap, his eyes full of empathy. Conversely, when she laughed, he seemed invigorated, as if sharing in her joy. In those moments, Olivia felt a deep connection with him that transcended the typical dynamic between pet and owner. Then, on a cold evening in early winter, as Olivia sat by the fireplace, Milo approached her and nudged her hand. As she absent-mindedly began to scratch behind his ears, he closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't just seeking affection. He was waiting, as if he knew something was about to happen. As she bent down to kiss the top of his head, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart flutter. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of recognition, a flicker of understanding that seemed far beyond what she'd ever expect from a dog. It sent a shiver down her spine. Olivia had never thought of herself as someone dependent on others. She had built her life around independence, focusing on her career, friendships, and managing her emotions alone. But since Milo had entered her life, things had changed. The quiet moments that once felt so lonely were now filled with the soft sound of Milo's paws on the hardwood floors, his rhythmic panting as he sat by her feet. He wasn't just a companion anymore. He was her anchor. Each morning, as the sun peeked through the curtains, Milo was there by her side, patiently waiting for her to stir. He didn't demand attention, but his presence was undeniable. He would nudge her hand or gently place his head on her lap when she sat on the couch, offering her comfort. More than that, Olivia began to realize how much she had come to rely on Milo's affection, especially with Noah no longer around. The house was quieter without Noah's laughter, without his presence in the kitchen. But Milo seemed to fill that void in a way that felt almost too perfect. He followed her around, sitting in every room, always looking up at her with those big brown eyes. Olivia began to think that he understood her pain. It was strange to imagine that a dog could grasp something as complex as grief, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Milo's calm demeanor and gentle nature were a balm to her wounded heart, and over time she started to treat him less like a pet and more like a companion. He was always there for her, particularly at night. Milo would curl up at the base of her bed, his body warm and close to hers. Occasionally, when she woke in the middle of the night, she would find him near her head, his breath gentle against her ear, his eyes wide open as if guarding her. There was a depth in his gaze that Olivia couldn't quite comprehend. He wasn't simply a dog, she thought. He seemed to be something more, something that understood her in a way no one else could. Despite her growing connection with him, there was a lingering discomfort that Olivia couldn't quite identify. It started to manifest in small ways. Milo's insistence on staying near her at all times, even when she was doing something as mundane as brushing her teeth or folding laundry. It wasn't that he was overly needy, but the subtlety of his attention was starting to feel overwhelming, almost too constant. One evening, as Olivia settled into bed, she glanced over at Milo, who was sitting next to her nightstand, his eyes fixed on her. There was no wagging tail or playful bark. Instead, he was just staring at her, seemingly waiting for something. She muttered a greeting, but the dog didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer to the bed and lay down, resting his head on the pillow. Olivia paused, a chill running down her spine. She wasn't sure why, but something about this moment felt unsettling. His closeness and his desire for solace seemed overly intimate for a pet. Perhaps I'm just imagining things, she told herself, dismissing the uneasy feeling. Yet, as she drifted off to sleep, Milo stayed close by her, his warmth and unyielding presence lingering. Days went on in the same way, with Milo always at her side. She tried to focus on other aspects of her life, her work, her social activities, her hobbies, but Milo's presence was constant, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She began to feel as though she couldn't breathe without him, as if he had become a permanent part of her existence, something she could no longer envision living without. And that realization frightened her. It wasn't until a rainy evening 2 weeks later that Olivia truly recognized how deep their emotional bond had grown. She returned home late from a work event, tired and drained, and when she entered her house, Milo was waiting at the door, his eyes wide and expectant. But this time, there was something different in them, almost knowing. "Hey, buddy," Olivia said softly, trying to push aside the rising tension inside her. She crouched down to pet him, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he just stared at her, his body tense, as though he was preparing for something. A shiver ran down her spine, but she brushed it off. Recently, Milo had been acting strangely, which she attributed to the weather-induced anxiety, though she wasn't sure if it was also a result of her newly formed reading habits. She wondered if his odd behavior was merely that, odd, or if something truly unusual was happening. Later that night, as Olivia lay in bed, Milo climbed up beside her, settling into his usual spot at the foot of the bed. But when Olivia reached out to scratch his ears, she noticed that he was becoming more insistent, guiding her hand toward his face and pressing his body against hers with an unexpected intensity. It felt strange, as if he was demanding her attention in a way she couldn't explain. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just a dog showing affection. But the discomfort lingered. "Good night, Milo," she murmured. Though the dog remained still, his body pressed against hers, as if anticipating her next move. Weeks passed, but Olivia couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The closer Milo stayed to her, the more unsettling his presence became. His body was always near hers, constantly following her every movement. The subtle shift in the way he looked at her, imbued with emotion, seemed to go beyond the typical affection a dog has for its owner. It was as though he was trying to communicate something, a message that Olivia wasn't sure she was ready to receive. One evening, after another long day at work, Olivia came home to find Milo sitting at the door, waiting for her. This time, there was no wagging tail or excited bark. Instead, he sat there, still and silent, as if he had been waiting for her arrival. He stayed quiet and still, his eyes locked on her. She had grown used to his attentiveness, but tonight felt different. "What's troubling you?" Milo asked, his voice soft yet strained. Although she didn't respond as she walked past him to hang her coat, she could sense his gaze following every movement, a stare so intense it sent a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, Milo moved closer, nudging her leg with his nose. She froze, her heart pounding, and for a brief moment she saw a spark of desire in his eyes, which made her retreat. The air between them seemed charged, as though an invisible barrier had been crossed, though she couldn't put it into words. "Stop it, Milo," Olivia whispered, her voice shaky, but Milo remained silent, closing the distance and rubbing against her as if seeking comfort. It felt unnervingly close and strange. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to dismiss the unsettling thoughts. She didn't want to admit the growing connection she felt toward Milo. After all, he was just a dog, she reminded herself. Yet, as she felt his body press against hers once again, she couldn't help but question whether it was truly simple affection or something more complicated at play. The following days were filled with tension. Olivia couldn't ignore Milo's behavior. His persistent closeness, his constant nudges, and his constant presence in every room. He had always been needy, but this was different. It was as if he was trying to communicate something more than what a dog could express. Olivia's mind raced. Was she overthinking this? Was it simply the natural desire for companionship in a dog, or was there something more ominous at work, something beyond her comprehension? Each night as Milo settled near her, a sense of unease lingered. She tried to push it away, focusing on other things, but the tension between them was undeniable. It went beyond mere physical closeness. It carried an emotional weight. Milo seemed to fill the emptiness left by Noah, his gaze deep and understanding. This intensity was becoming overwhelming for Olivia, and it was impossible to ignore. For weeks, the tension had been mounting, each day bringing them closer to a confrontation that Olivia feared she could not prevent. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison, suffocated by Milo's constant presence and the relentless pressure of his gaze. His need for closeness and touch had shifted from simple affection to obsession, a reality Olivia had always subconsciously known. Although she had expected it, now that it was real, she didn't know how to break free from it. That night, everything seemed to come to a head. Olivia had spent the day at work, trying to ignore the weight of Milo's presence in her life, believing that staying busy would ease the discomfort. But as she entered her home, she was met by the same intensity that had been building for days. Milo waited by the door, tail wagging, acting as if nothing were wrong. However, as Olivia walked past him to set her keys on the table, she noticed something was different. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. There was a new sense of purpose in his movements, accompanied by an urgency she hadn't seen before. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself she was just being paranoid, but the knot in her stomach told a different story. She walked to the kitchen, trying to clear her mind, but Milo followed, his paws softly clicking against the floor, maintaining his unwavering focus. As she stood there, trying to shake off the unease, Milo sat at her feet, staring up at her. Despite her attempts to ignore it, the unsettling feeling remained. That night, as Olivia lay in bed, she felt the familiar weight of Milo beside her. He used to rest at the foot of the bed, but now he stayed right next to her, his presence constant. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm her thoughts, she felt Milo's gaze upon her. When she turned to him, she saw him watching her with an unblinking, intense stare. It was as though he was waiting for her to make the first move, acknowledging the connection between them. Olivia swallowed, her breath shallow. "Why are you looking at me like that, Milo?" She whispered into the quiet, but he remained silent, still staring at her. Without a word, Milo shifted, sliding closer until he was right next to her. His fur brushed against her skin. Olivia's heart raced, feeling completely suffocated by his warmth and closeness. She resisted him, yet he kept pressing forward. Milo's body weighed heavily on her, seemingly unable to release her. "Stop," Olivia whispered, her voice quivering. Despite her plea, Milo did not relent. He pushed against her again, his body exerting more pressure on her side. She could feel the tension in his muscles and the urgent force in his movements. He was no longer merely seeking comfort. This had shifted into something more intense, something unfamiliar that made her feel like she was losing control. The realization struck her suddenly. This wasn't just affection anymore. It had become possessiveness and manipulation, something ominous. She recoiled, pressing her back to the headboard, trying to regain her space. But he followed her, always near, his body radiating warmth against hers, his breathing slow and deliberate. It was as if he was making sure she stayed close, ensuring that she was where he needed her to be. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized the helplessness of her situation. She had never felt so powerless. She wasn't just afraid of Milo, she was afraid of who she was becoming, how she had allowed this bond to twist and tighten around her. Her thoughts, her emotions, everything was clouded by the tension in the room. Now she couldn't ignore what was happening between them. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out. She thought about calling for help or escaping the house, but deep down she knew she couldn't. The connection with Milo had grown too strong, too overwhelming. It was as if he had control over every thought, and she was powerless to stop him. "Why is this happening?" Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. She felt as if she were drowning in the suffocating weight of the situation. As if to confirm her fears, Milo drew closer, pressing his head against her chest, closing his eyes for a moment. But then, just as quickly, he opened them again, and she felt his gaze like a silent command, a challenge. There was no turning back. "Please," Olivia whispered, her voice desperate, her hands shaking as they reached out to push him away. But Milo didn't move. He was stronger now, more insistent. His once comforting presence had transformed into something she couldn't control. She tried to reason with herself, tried to convince herself that this was just a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment, but deep inside, she knew better. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. It was something darker. As Olivia lay there, trapped in the warmth of Milo's presence, she wondered how things had gotten to this point. How had she allowed this to spiral so far? The night stretched on in stifling silence, and Olivia realized that she had lost control over what was to come. The experience felt like a fog, each passing moment heavier than the last. Her life had become a haze of confusion, isolation, and anxiety. She tried to push Milo away, to separate herself from him, but each time he came back with greater force. It wasn't just that he followed her, it was as if he was always watching, always present. She tried reaching out to a friend, told herself she might be overthinking it, but the more she pondered, the more she realized that her fears weren't unfounded. Milo was no longer just a dog. He had become so enmeshed in her life that the lines between them had blurred. It wasn't just affection, it was domination, obsession. She couldn't take it any longer. One evening, she stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were empty, her skin pale. She had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and when she did sleep, Milo was always beside her. She felt as if she were losing herself, merging into the background of her own life, a mere object for Milo to control. "Why do you keep doing this? Why don't you leave me alone?" she whispered to her reflection. There was no reply, just the soft, relentless tapping of Milo's paws on the floor as he entered the room. When Milo approached her that night, Olivia shivered, feeling a chill run down her spine. He had been distant recently, but tonight felt different. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Olivia felt as though he could see into the very core of her being. "Just leave me alone," she pleaded, her voice trembling, but Milo didn't respond. He simply remained seated in silence, staring at her with an unwavering gaze. The stillness in the room was overpowering. Olivia retreated to the farthest corner of the room, her heart racing. She understood that this situation was unsustainable and that she had to escape. But how? Where could she go? She was unable to avoid him. Milo was no longer physically or emotionally present in her life or her spirit. As she left the room, Milo followed closely behind, his presence looming like a dark shadow. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she hurried toward the door, desperate to escape before it was too late. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, Milo lunged forward, blocking her path. "Milo, stop!" Olivia cried, her voice trembling as she tried to push him away. But Milo was stronger than she had realized, his body pressing against hers, his fur heavy, and she could feel his breath on her skin. He was determined to keep her now and indefinitely. For the first time, Olivia understood that this was no longer about love. It had spiraled into something uncontrollable, driven by Milo's desire for dominance and complete ownership of her, something she had allowed. She had given him absolute control over her life. Now, it was too late to reverse it. In one final desperate effort, Olivia broke free from his grasp and fled the room. She ran until she reached the cool night air, which struck her face. But as she stood there, gasping for air, she knew that Milo was still with her, following her, watching her every move. That night, sleep eluded her. She sat on the couch, reflecting on a way to escape, but every plan she came up with seemed useless. She had no confidant, and despite her desire to break free, Milo had become both her reality and her nightmare. The most troubling part was her uncertainty about whether she truly wanted to leave. Deep down, a part of her still craved the closeness and connection Milo offered, even though it was stifling. The next morning, Olivia awoke to an eerie silence. Despite her lack of rest, she felt inexplicably rejuvenated. The weight of the previous days had lifted, though she knew this sense of relief would be fleeting. Even though Milo was somewhere in the house, Olivia felt an unfamiliar determination. She had to end this. The atmosphere of the house felt different. It seemed emptier, as though something had shifted in the air. Olivia knew she could no longer live like this. She had endured enough, and now the essential question remained. What kind of life was this? While she was still in the living room, pondering her next move, Milo appeared in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her with a piercing intensity that sent a chill down her spine. This time, she didn't flinch. She simply stared back at him. "It's over," Olivia declared, her voice firm despite the tremble in her hands. "You can no longer control me." After a brief silence, Milo slowly advanced toward her, but this time Olivia didn't retreat. She stood her ground, refusing to let him regain his power over her. He moved around her slowly, almost as if weighing her up, and then, to her surprise, he stopped. It was as though he finally understood. For the first time in weeks, Olivia felt a strange calmness. Milo would no longer harm her. He would no longer confine her. The power had shifted, and for the first time, Olivia felt free. But her freedom came at a price. Olivia realized she could no longer stay in this place, burdened by memories of the past and the constant presence of Milo in her thoughts. She packed a suitcase and left. As she stepped out of her home, she understood that her life would change irreparably. However, for the first time in a long while, she felt truly free, unburdened by Milo and the oppressive control he had once had over her. As she left, she reflected on the lessons she had learned. Love can be beautiful but dangerous, and the line between affection and obsession can blur, often unnoticed until it is too late. But Olivia had learned one undeniable truth. She was now the master of her own life, and no one, not even Milo, could take that autonomy from her.